The Arrow and the Animal. How Language Birthed God, and God Remade Us. By Elias Winter. October 18th, 2025. Read by an automated voice. Section 1. The Day the Word Knelt. Did worship and language start together? Night wind pressed its mouth to the cave and breathed. The fire answered with a lean and a hiss. A child, hair stuck to her forehead with smoke, lifted her cheeks to the gust and shaped it back with her lips. Who? Then laughed, because the sound moved when she moved. An elder raised a palm, not to hush her, but to address the wind, as if the air were a someone. The band watched his hand hover in the wavering light. Another reached for ochre and dragged a short red line across a flat stone. Not a picture of anything, just a mark that said, "Here, now." None of them would have called it prayer. None of them would have called it speech. But the child's sound stopped being mere noise the moment the elder's palm turned outward like a face. The gesture bent the air into a meeting. The wind was no longer a push, it was a presence, and the mark on stone? It turned a passing breath into something that could be returned to, tomorrow, or after a season, or after someone died. A trace that teaches the future to remember. In that small convergence, mimicry, hand, mark, the animal crossed a seam. Not a thunderclap, no angelic announcement, just a quiet adjustment in the joints of attention. Sound became about, gesture became toward, mark became for. The world acquired grammar, and the grammar bowed. This is my answer to the question. Worship and language did not arrive like two strangers on different boats, waving from a distance. They walked up the same riverbank, wet with the same water. A word that can point beyond what is present also knows how to kneel. To say you to a wind, an ancestor, a night sky is to enter a relation that didn't exist a breath earlier. In that relation, something we later named God appears, not as an invention, but as a meeting that makes itself real by being met. What changed first? The body or the world? Perhaps neither. Perhaps what changed was the angle. The creature tilted, and the earth tilted with it. The throat learned to shape air into meaning. The hand learned to hold a silence open long enough for the meaning to gather. The moment a sound can wait for an answer, the invisible has a place to stand. Call this the day the word knelt. The child's breath wasn't a prayer. The elder's palm wasn't a sermon. But together they formed the smallest possible altar. An address, an answer, a shared pause. The tribe felt it without explaining it, the same way a flock feels the turn of the leading bird. The fire listened. The wind kept talking. The red line on the stone darkened, drying into something sturdier than the moment. I don't think the divine began as a person in the sky. It began as a relation, a crossing between a creature and what exceeds it. A river is only a river when banks come to meet it. The first bank was attention. The second bank was reverence. Between them, reality started to flow differently. The same animals, the same weather, but now threaded by an unseen corridor where a word could travel and return with consequence. If that reads like poetry, remember, the scene is ordinary. Someone hums, someone answers, someone marks. The novelty is not the tools, it's the aboutness, the way a sound outlives its moment, the way a mark holds a place for a meaning that is not yet here. That holding a place is our earliest shrine. Not a temple, just a notch in time where the living could step back, look forward, and say again. You could say the human was born twice, first from blood and bone, then from this, a second birth into shared imagination, into a world where a gust is a guest, a death is a passage, and a line of ochre can keep company with the absent. After that, the creature who makes the sound is no longer simply one animal among many. It has a corridor through which it can speak to what is not present and be shaped by what it cannot see. Some will insist that language came first and worship was an overlay, or that worship came first and language dressed it up later. I can't find the seam. The first time a sound reached past survival, past hunger, fear, mating, it had already taken a knee. And the first time a body bowed, to wind, to bones, to stars, it had already learned to say you. Two mirrors at an angle making a hallway out of light. Back at the cave mouth, the elder lowered his hand. The band resumed their small talk of embers and sinew. The child tried the wind again. Whoo! Then quieter, as if the air had become a listener who might be startled. Inside the cave, the red line waited. No one owned it, and yet it belonged to them all. Tomorrow, someone might add a second line. Later, someone might tell a story about why the lines must be made when the wind is from the west. The story would come after. The relation was already there. If we need a name for that night, we can borrow one from later centuries and risk a little anachronism, creation. Not the making of mountains, but the making of between. The world did not become new. We did. And we became new by finding a way for the world to address us back. Section 2. When sound became reverence. If worship started, was that the organic birth of God? I don't think anyone decided it. No vote, no manifesto, no clever hunter saying, "Let's invent the divine." It felt more like a threshold the body crossed by accident and then could never uncross, like stepping from sand into surf and discovering that the water keeps making more shore for you to stand on. Here's how I see it now. The moment a sound leaves the mouth as address, it builds the very space it addresses. Call it God. Call it the unseen. Call it the more than here. The calling makes room for the answer. Like a cup held out under an empty sky, suddenly the sky has somewhere to rain. Worship is that cup. And once the rain exists, you can't say the cup imagined water. The cup revealed it. This is why I can't treat the divine as a mere projection, and I can't treat it as a thunderbolt from above. It feels like a reciprocal birth, a two-sided beginning where relation arrives before doctrine. When a creature speaks beyond the visible, it creates a field. Inside that field, something answers, sometimes with wind, sometimes with silence that isn't empty. And in that answering, the speaker is changed. The throat that once knew only warning and mating cry discovers vow. The old formulations, humans created God, or God created humans, both miss the turning. The truth sits between them, alive and unstable, like a bridge that exists only while you're walking on it. Worship brings the divine into view. The divine brings the worshipper into being. If this sounds airy, drop it back into the muscles. Think of promise. Before promises, a body belongs to appetite and threat. After promises, a body belongs also to its word. The word extends the self past the instant. It gives tomorrow a claim on today. That extension is not an idea. It's a new skeletal piece added to the human. You can feel it in the ache when you want to break your vow and cannot without breaking yourself. That ache is proof that the field is real. Or take mourning. An animal keens and moves on. A human tucks a bead beside a bone, returns to the place, says a name aloud after the mouth that owned it is gone. The name reaches into absence and drags back meaning. In the reach, absence thickens into presence-shaped space. We learn to live with a someone we cannot touch. That practice trains the soul for God long before the word God is minted. I keep circling a metaphor that feels right: a violin and a note. The instrument is carved into a shape that invites a particular kind of sound into the world. Without the note, the violin is only wood and glue. Without the violin, the note has nowhere to gather its resonance. Worship is the carving. The divine is the resonance that fills it. And once the note has sounded, the ear changes. It can never again hear silence as mere lack. Silence becomes a room. This is why I'm careful with the word invention. We invented altars, yes. We invented names and rituals and the grammar that arranges them. But the thing that met us inside those inventions was not made by our hands. We shaped the space. Something stepped in. If you've ever lit a candle alone and felt your solitude tilt, ever so slightly, into company, you've known this without a priest to explain it. There's also the matter of cost. No one pays for fantasies. We pay for realities. The turn to worship came with prices too consistent and too heavy to be a collective daydream. Restraints accepted, appetites delayed, bodies veiled, words bound to deeds. We do not sacrifice for a figment. We sacrifice because the relation bites back when we betray it. Only real bridges can drop you. I imagine the first time someone whispered "thank you" into the air after a hunt went well. Not gratitude to a face, but to the source behind the luck. That thank you did not travel nowhere. It left, and a subtle pressure returned, the way the air presses a palm that presses it. The tribe began to live as if the behind were part of the fabric, and then the fabric held. Harvest after harvest, death after death, the habit of address stitched a world that answered often enough to keep the stitch from slipping. From there, the rest follows. The self is no longer a sack of wants. It acquires a front and a back, a before and after. The group is no longer a swarm. It acquires a center, not a person, but a shared orientation. And the world is no longer mere scenery. It acquires voices, some stern, some tender, most of them unnameable until we try to name them and fail beautifully. So yes, worship and language came together, not as twins, but as a sentence with a verb that creates its own subject. The act of addressing conjured an addressee. The presence of an addressee forged a different kind of addresser. We learned to speak to what exceeds us, and in learning, we exceeded what we had been. If I must pin it to one line, it is this: we are the animal that opened a door and found that the door, once opened us. Section 3. The group finds its center. What does God do to a group of humans? Before names had gods in them, the band still had mornings. A hunt meant people who did not share a stomach would share a plan. Language lined up bodies like stones in a river, giving the current a way through. You flank left. I startle from the brush. You wait for the turn. That much is coordination. But something else arrived on those mornings. A hush before the run, a breath held in common. Someone touched the point of a spear to the earth. Someone glanced toward a shoulder of sky. Someone murmured. Not to a person, not quite. The sound wasn't orders. It was a circle drawn in the dark, a way of saying, our many intentions will be one intention for the next few hours. The throat is a small drum. The band felt a beat that wasn't inside any single chest, and yet a drum heard by every chest. That is what I mean by God as the group's center. Language synchronizes minds. Worship synchronizes meanings. Minds can line up and still break under fear. Meanings can hold when fear arrives. When the boar turns too soon and the brush explodes wrong, it is meaning, not orders, that keeps the rear guard from sprinting for the trees. They stay because the center holds. They stay because their bodies now answer to a radius, not just a nerve. Afterward, if the kill is clean, a portion is set aside with a quiet formality no one invented on purpose. No one eats that part until the right story is told over it. How the animal ran, how the wind misled, how the ancestor whose name is not to be spoken tugged the boar's hoof at the last moment. The story is not entertainment. It's a lighthouse made of breath, sweeping across the group to say, "You are seen. You are one. You are bound by something that preceded you and will outlast you." The center reveals itself most clearly when things are not clean. A failed hunt means there isn't enough meat. Now watch the center work. The elder takes less than the child. The sentry eats after those who ran. This is not instinct. Appetite has its own arithmetic. It's a vow remembered by the mouth. A young man sets down his share beside a woman who bled all day without complaint. He does it with the casualness of someone conditioned by a we that has moral weather inside it. A breeze that says again, a gust that says not like that. In a world without writing, those breezes are law. If you want to see how deep the center goes, stand at a burial. A bead is placed by a bone. A strip of hide is knotted 3 times. Someone presses a warm brow to a cold cheek and says a name aloud, as if the syllables were a path the living will need later. The child who asks, "Why the bead?" is already being drafted into meaning. The answer will shift, because we remember, because she loved the river, because the bead is from her mother's hand, but the function is steady. The answer points away from the individual voice toward the middle of the circle where answers become ours. The center lets grief be carried by many backs. Sacrifice becomes possible here. Not the theatrical kind, but the daily version. The hunter who takes the long watch in the wet because someone must. The mother who goes hungry for the old man with the failing knee. The quiet man who steps forward when the path is narrow, and the cat prints are fresh. Instinct can rush a cliff for kin, yes, but it is the center, the consecrated we, that can command a body to bleed for someone who shares no blood. It is the center that can tell a stranger, "You belong," and make it true at cost. People talk about leadership as if a person were the center. That is a late luxury. In the older geometry, the leader is only a steward of the empty middle, the gap where the group's reasons live. A bully tries to stand in the center. A leader stands at the edge and points to it. You can feel the difference in your spine. One compels, the other gathers. One uses fear to make obedience. The other clarifies meaning until obedience feels like recognition. This is why the early taboos grew around kinship beds, blood, fire, and food. The center is built from what most easily tears a band apart. To eat without sharing, to touch without vow, to speak without truth, to burn what the group needs to keep alive. Each act is a small theft from the middle. Each ritual is a repair, a stitch pulled tight so the fabric holds under weather. Sometimes a child tries a forbidden thing, not out of malice, but curiosity. And the band must decide, punish or teach. The center answers with pattern. The punishment is never the point. The point is to restore the rhythm, to bring the child back to the beat everyone can hear. Even the scold is done in chorus. That's how mercy became practical. Because a center that requires many bodies cannot afford to break one more than it must. I have seen modern versions of all this in rooms with electric light. A team pausing before the hard call, someone naming the risk so plainly that fear loses its lonely edge. Food passed to the anxious first. Silence kept after the meeting so the shyest voice can catch up and say the thing that saves a week. None of us would call it worship, but the same geometry appears. An empty middle, a shared radius, a beat. So what does God do to a group of humans? Not miracles, orientation. A scattered many becomes a form. The form learns to stay when it wants to run, to give when it wants to hoard, to bury with a hand that shakes and still makes the knot. God is the word we use when the circle closes and, somehow, holds, when a meaning that no one owns becomes the safest place to stand. Section 4. The price of standing upright. Did God take our freedom away? Standing changed the view, and the terms. When the word learned to address, the body had to learn to withhold, not as punishment, as engineering. A river that wants to reach the valley consents to banks. Freedom without banks is only flood. The first clothing was not modesty in the modern sense, it was threshold. A strip of hide stitched under the ribs said, "This heat is ours to keep. This skin is not for every eye. This power will move on cue, not impulse." Cloth arrived as a door where there had been only air. Once there is a door, there are two worlds, inside and out. After that, the human day includes choices the animal never has to make. When to open, when to close, when to bolt the latch against your own hand. People say the fall began with an apple. I think it began with a pause. The pause is the new organ we grew when language learned the word no. Before that, appetite ran a straight road. After, the road passed through a gate that could refuse. The price of that gate was shame, the body's dizziness when it discovers it can be seen. Shame isn't a verdict. It's an altitude sickness from suddenly standing in thinner air. We put on coverings the way climbers put on oxygen. Not because the mountain hates lungs, but because breath must be managed now. You can feel the cost in ordinary minutes. A hand rises to strike and meets a remembered rule like a wall it built itself. The wall stops the hand. The stopping hurts. That ache is civilization grinding its teeth so your neighbor's bones don't. A desire flares and finds it cannot cash itself without a vow being broken. The desire dims, the vow stays. Something inside goes quiet and strong. We call the quiet character, as if it were furniture. It is more like a brace that keeps a spine from folding. It would be easier to live without these braces. It would also be shorter. The band that lets appetite choose always will not remain a band. The child is eaten first, by hunger, by envy, by the nearest man whose fear baptized itself as courage. The point of law was never to impress a god. It was to teach a future how to arrive in one piece. The first taboo was a sandbag thrown against a rising river. Here, not over the threshold. Here, keep the fire lit. Here, do not take from a sleeping mouth. If this sounds sterile, watch the tenderness laws produce. A cloth between two bodies sets the stage for consent to be audible. A rule that food is shared before the strongest eat turns dinner into a small daily mercy. A custom that words bind the speaker lets love exist as more than flood and fade. Constraints are not the end of desire. They are rooms where desire can survive the weather. Still, the loss is real. We gave up immediacy, and immediacy keeps knocking. Our skin remembers its era without doorways. The body longs to tear the fabric, to breathe without filter. to spend what it has the instant it has it. Eden is not a location. It's the memory of unmediated time. Every vow is a border drawing that memory back from the edge. So did God take our freedom? Better, God split it. Before, freedom meant I can. After, freedom also meant I may or I must not. The first is a muscle. The second is a conscience. Put together, they make a human capable of building bridges instead of jumping from them. Tear them apart, and you get a giant with infant hands. The story of the fruit makes more sense if you imagine it as the moment the creature learns consequence. Knowledge of good and evil is not a catalogue of sins. It's the discovery that actions make shapes that last longer than appetite. Eat now, alter the map. Touch now, change a life. Speak now, bind tomorrow. The bite is the moment the mouth becomes a maker of futures. No wonder we covered ourselves. Makers wear aprons. There are softer prices, too. Play changes, song changes, laughter changes. They do not vanish. They learn timing. A joke waits till the burial is over. A song holds a note back so the chorus can land. A lover pauses not from fear, but from care. And in the pause, the other person becomes more visible than the self. The body doesn't disappear under cloth. It concentrates. I think of a kiln. Clay left in the rain is honest and useless. Clay set in a kiln loses something, the cool ease of mud, but becomes able to hold water for others. We put ourselves in heat and call it discipline. The finished jar is not free in the way wet clay was. It is free in a new way. It does not collapse when filled. There is a misreading that says, constraint is contempt for the body. That mistake is loud in every century. But the older wisdom is simpler. Do not humiliate the animal you live inside. Do not abandon it either. Harness it like fire. Contained not because flame is shameful, but because roofs exist, and sleeping children, and tomorrow's grain. One more scene. A young man returns a knife he had hidden. No one saw him take it. He lays it down in front of the elder without speech. He is not caught. He is choosing a shape for himself. He looks smaller in that moment, and larger. That is the paradox of standing upright. The law makes him bow. The bow makes him human. So yes, the word knelt, and so did the body. Not as defeat, but as craft. We traded the rush of always now for the long, survivable day. We closed some doors so that love, promise, and grief could have walls to echo from. The cost is the ache you feel at thresholds. The gain is a world that can hold you when you fall. Section 5. The Animal's Reply. Why do we ache to go back? Because the body remembers a country without doors. You can feel the pull in small hours. The mind picks its lock. The pulse wants the shortest road. The animal isn't wicked. It is homesick. It wants the weather it was born in. Immediacy, heat without handle, hunger answered at the speed of teeth. Civilization hears this and replies with rooms, vows, clocks. The animal hears rooms, vows, clocks, and replies with a low tide tugging at every mooring in us. We romanticize that earlier shore. Memory edits out the hyenas and keeps the moon. The danger of the past falls out of the frame. The sweetness stays. So we devise modern rituals to mimic unmediated life while keeping the fridge and the ambulance. Some are harmless, dancing until shoes come off, fasting, plunging into cold water. Some are corrosive. They aim at the hinges themselves, not at a window for air. This is where transgression enters, not as villain, but as physics. Constraint accumulates energy. Energy wants release. Every culture discovers two levers: violence and sex. They're not accidents, they are the oldest solvents for structure. Which is why every altar stands near rules about blood and beds. If the center is made of promises, these are the places promise phrase. Modern pornography is a lab where this physics is refined. Its most clickable tropes are not new pleasures, they are inversions. The family, our smallest city, gets turned inside out. Consent, our speech made flesh, is performed as if it were irrelevant. Tenderness, our domesticated strength, goes missing on purpose. The scenarios aren't random. They are blueprints for entropy of the sacred. Take the pillars, reverse their meanings, record the collapse in high definition. I don't mean this moralistically, I mean it anthropologically. The industry packages the animal's grievance at being fenced by language and sells it back to us as spectacle. See? The hinges can come off. It's not just bodies on a screen, it's a thesis about order, that the most protected bonds, parent, child, sibling, teacher, student, boss/employee, are costumes you can rip open to get at the trembling underneath. The thrill is partly erotic. The deeper thrill is anti-civilizational, a fantasy that the mask is the lie and the skin is the truth. But masks weren't made to deceive. They were made to hold shape. Take them off and, yes, you feel wind on your face. Also wind in the rafters. A house that unhooks its doors to taste freedom will soon discover what rain thinks of rugs. We can survive a storm. We cannot survive storm as principle. There's a quieter theater for the same ache. The feud dressed up as authenticity. The public humiliation disguised as honesty. The appetite for ruinous truth-telling that tears a community and calls it brave. These, too, are the body's protest against choreography. They promise the relief of unrehearsed life. What they deliver is more primitive. Life stripped of the agreements that let tomorrow trust today. I've called this the animal's reply, not the animal's error, on purpose. The longing isn't lying, it's testimony. It says we paid a price for the sacred. It says something in us misses the rush of unbroken present tense. A culture that only shames this longing becomes brittle. It forces the ache underground until it returns as flood. But a culture that worships the longing becomes a bonfire that forgets roofs exist. So what to do with the pull? Not denial, not surrender, containment with mercy. Give the animal daylight, labor that tires the muscles, play that risks harmlessly, art that uses danger like color, rituals that let the pulse speak without letting it govern. Keep spaces where laughter can be too loud and nobody breaks. Keep spaces where silence can be total and nobody is afraid. A society without these valves will look for them in the places that collapse the house. And about pornography specifically, the response can't be mere disgust. Disgust is a weak scaffold. The counter to inversion is true form. Depictions of desire that revere the other. Scripts where consent is not whispered etiquette, but the plot. Bonds where ferocity and safety coexist without canceling each other. If that sounds quaint, look at our outcomes. We are engineering our appetites. We can also engineer their dignity. Underneath all of this is a simpler truth. The body wants to know it wasn't betrayed by the soul. If the sacred only ever says no, the animal will rightly distrust it. The sacred must learn a grammar of yes. Yes to pleasure that doesn't derange belonging. Yes to power that protects. Yes to speed in seasons made for speed. Yes to rest that isn't anesthesia. We ache to go back because part of us never left. The ribs still remember fur. The eyes still know how to hunt in low light. The hands still recognize the shape of a throat they must never close. Civilization isn't a denial of these memories. It's a way to house them. A good house doesn't shame the fire. It gives it a hearth. So the animal replies, and we should listen. But the reply isn't a map. It's weather. Feel it. Name it. Let it blow the smoke out of the room. Then bar the door again. Not against life, but for it. The hinges should move. They should not come loose. The mask should breathe. It should not pretend not to be a mask. And the body, hungry and honest, should be able to look at the law and recognize itself. Not a prison, but a frame that keeps the portrait from slipping to the floor. Section 6. Ladders, Envy, and the Pact. What did humans do with their new position, and what pushes back? The day we learned to address the invisible, we also learned to sort the visible. The spark that set us apart cast shadows that looked like steps. We stood on the first one and called it human. Then we built a ladder under our feet. At first, the ladder felt like observation. We have words. Other creatures do not. We bury our dead. They leave bones to the weather. We bind ourselves with vows. They follow the season. Soon the ladder hardened into verdict. We are higher, so we may take. We are nearer to the voice at the center, so we may speak for it. The calf tied to a post, the field cleared of wolves, the snares along the river. These were argued as necessities. Then the argument spread to people. Some closer to the animal, some closer to God. The distances were drawn with the ink of power. This is the hazard baked into elevation. Once a creature is marked as different, it is only a short walk to being marked as better. The divine spark that taught us to protect also gave us a language to justify. We blessed our appetite, called dominion stewardship when we were careful, and fate when we were not. We sorted bodies, faces, tongues. We stacked them. When the stack groaned, we told stories about how gravity itself preferred us. I don't say this to indict worship. I say it to tell the truth about what humans do when handed meaning and muscle at the same time. We needed a way to hold the animal world without being swallowed by it. We built tools, laws, fences. Then fear and desire asked for more. We built categories that looked like fences but fenced people. Even the word soul has been weaponized, used to lift and used to crush. There is another force in this section, one we've already met, but now named differently. Envy. Not the petty kind that stares at a neighbor's bowl, but the ancient pressure of the unformed, the great outside that resents the rung we claim. Call it the devil if you like, not a cartoon monarch of flame, but the principle that whispers downward. It doesn't merely hate what we have, it hates the difference. It wants the ladder knocked flat, so everything lies again in a single plane of appetite and weather. The whisper is smooth. Why all these doors, these vows, this bowing to an invisible center? Come back to the shore without banks. Unhook the hinges. Taste the rush. It promises freedom from the ache of conscience and the weight of belonging. And it delivers, briefly. The first gulp of air outside the house is real. Then the rain starts. The pact looks like this in any century. Give up the claim that you are answerable to more than yourself. No center, no covenant, no sacred. And in exchange, you will feel unburdened. The cost is written in disappearing ink. Without that claim, you also give up the protections that come with it. If you are only an animal, you are available to other animals, edible, usable, tradable. The world that eats calves will eat you too, once your place in the circle dissolves. The crown you threw away because it felt heavy returns as a collar. Watch how the two errors mirror each other. On one side, humans enthrone themselves and turn the divine spark into a license to dominate, the crown that becomes a cage for everyone beneath. On the other side, humans tore up the charter that set them apart and flowed back into appetite, the freedom with the teeth out. In both cases, the image of the human is damaged, either inflated until it crushes others, or deflated until others may crush it without guilt. Consider 3 small scenes. A pasture at noon. A child asks why the lamb is ours to shear and eat. The father gives a useful answer about winter and hunger. Then he adds a sentence that's too smooth. They have no souls. A practical act acquires a metaphysical alibi. The child learns not just to live, but to rank. A market at dawn. A man is inspected like a tool. The buyer speaks about lineage, destiny, natural order. The language is polished, the logic neat. The latter is now a law. The divine is dragged to the booth to notarize the bill of sale. Somewhere, a priest will call this blasphemy. Somewhere else, another priest will call it providence. A city at midnight. A woman says she owes nothing to anyone, that the only truth is the surge she can catch. For a while the night agrees. Then someone stronger takes her at her logic. Without a shared center, the only remaining court is strength. She is not to blame for the world's cruelty. But the pact she signed with the dark gave the dark jurisdiction. In each scene, the devil's work is envy of distinction, the distinction that made a human answerable to more than hunger. It wants that answerability gone. Failing that, it will settle for making the highest rung cruel so that falling feels like justice. There is a temptation, in response, to refuse the latter entirely, to claim there is no difference between us and other animals beyond delusion. But difference does not have to mean supremacy. It can mean obligation. The divine spark does not absolve us of kinship, it heightens it. If we can say you to the wind and the dead, we can say you to the Lamb. That you is the beginning of mercy. The proper use of the ladder is to carry, not to climb away and saw it off. So what becomes of the devil in this frame? He remains useful as a name for gravity, the pull back to undifferentiated life, and for resentment, which prefers a flat world where nothing is asked of anyone beyond power. The pact remains, too, in seductive forms, cynicism that calls conscience a trick, thrill-seeking that mistakes risk for courage, ideologies that sanctify appetite because appetite is honest. Honesty alone is not holiness. Fire is honest. There is also a counterfeit piety to beware. The crown that forgets it is borrowed. When we imagine our nearness to the center as ownership, we turn guardianship into tyranny, stewardship into extraction. We become the bully who stands in the middle instead of pointing to it. The center will not be mocked forever. When a ladder is built from stolen shoulders, the ground remembers. Gravity gathers itself. What, then, is the right posture on the rung? First, kneeling while standing, a recognition that the difference that sets us apart is not a medal, but a mandate. To be the animal with vows is to be the animal that protects. Dominion without reverence is only theft with better grammar. Second, refusal of disappearing ink. Every freedom offered by the downward whisper gets read to the end of the contract. If it leaves you edible, usable, enslavable, it is not freedom. It is a coupon for your own undoing. Third, repair instead of denial. When our ladders have been used to crush, we don't rename the ladder. We rebuild it for carrying. Laws that once sorted by face or blood must be re-engineered to sort by need and danger. Rituals that once excused harm must be stripped of their alibis and return to their original work, binding the many to the good. I return to the metaphor of the crown and the cage. A crown is a circle of metal meant to remind a head that it is held. Worn rightly, it is a weight that bends the neck toward service. Worn wrongly, it becomes a cage for others. The test is simple. Does your nearness to the center increase the safety of the farthest person in the circle? If not, the devil is writing the minutes. We will always feel two languages in us: the language that climbs and blesses, and the language that unhooks and drinks the dark. The first can be arrogant, the second can be suicidal. Between them is the hard speech of stewardship, the tone that says we are set apart for keeping fire without burning roofs, for killing as little as a winter allows, for shielding the small from our stories about order. That is the non-spectacular heroism civilization asks, not the drama of angels and dragons, but the daily refusal to use the word God as a weapon, and the daily refusal to confuse appetite with liberation. The pact will always be offered. The ladder will always creak. Our work is to keep the center empty enough for truth, full enough for love, and bright enough that envy can see itself and walk away. Section 7. The Arrow and the Tightrope. If two forces live in us, how do we live? History isn't a staircase, it's a pendulum. We swing between the arrow that points toward order, language, vows, the center, and the gravity that pulls us back to immediacy, heat, appetite, the open shore. Time-bound and forgetful, we feel only the bruise of today's swing. When order is heavy, we dream of tide. When tide is wrecking boats, we build laws with iron hinges and call the clang progress. The art is not choosing a side. It is walking the rope stretched between them. The gorge below was carved by our own river. On one wall, the scars of chaos, on the other, the scorch of too much control. We cross because life is on both sides, body and halo, hunger and vow. So what does rope walking look like in an ordinary life? Ritual without humiliation. Keep forms that hold us. Meals begun with gratitude. Doors closed softly at night. A weekly pause that resets the pulse. But never use ritual to shame the animal we live inside. A fast that bruises the body lies about God. A feast that forgets the widow lies about joy. Law with tenderness. Laws exist to keep the small from being eaten. Write them that way. When the letter crushes the spirit, it was meant to guard, revise the letter. Mercy is not the breaking of order. It is the reason order was built. Speech that kneels. Let words remember their first posture. Speak to rather than about whenever you can. Address the person, the place, even the moment, as if it could answer, and then listen, as if it might. A vow is a bridge. Don't drive carts you can't repair across it. Valves for the animal. Build vented rooms. Work that exhausts without demeaning. Play that risks without wounding. Art that handles danger like a sharp tool. Give the body daylight, or it will go looking for torches. Fire in a hearth. Keep appetite and power where they warm and do not burn. Erotics that revere the other. Courage that protects rather than performs. Anger that builds a dam instead of opening the floodgates downstream. Crowns that bend the neck. If you carry authority, wear it like a weight that lowers your head toward service. Test yourself by distance. Does your nearness to the center increase the safety of those farthest from it? Remember the two norths. One compass point is belonging, the other is truth. If you follow truth without belonging, you become a blade. If you follow belonging without truth, you become a mask. The route is a zigzag, not a betrayal. There will be slips. The rope is narrow. When you fall toward chaos, return without self-contempt. The animal is loud when it thinks it's unloved. When you fall toward tyranny, return without self-justification. The crown is clever when it wants to hide its teeth. The point is not to stay spotless. The point is to keep the center empty enough for truth and full enough for love. Our age suffers temporal myopia. We feel the cost of restraint and forget the cost of its absence. Then we feel the cost of absence and forget why the restraints were built. So practice remembering. Visit the ruins the tide left. Visit the scars the iron left. Teach children both. Make them wary of anyone who sells only one story about safety. If a rule helps a weaker person stand, keep it. If a ritual opens a window in the room, keep it. If a pleasure leaves you more able to love tomorrow, keep it. These are low-tech tests. We can run them at the sink, on a sidewalk, in a boardroom, at a bed's edge. I returned to the first night at the cave mouth. The word knelt and the body learned to pause. That pause is still the rope maker. Take one breath, then another. Ask, what am I protecting? Who does this shape shelter? What will this choice make durable? If the answer keeps widening beyond your own skin, you're likely walking well. The tightrope is not punishment. It is how a creature with a throat and a soul gets across. Below is the river that made us. Above is the arrow that calls us. Between them is a line we keep remaking with our steps. Walk, and when you wobble, touch the pole to either side. The animal for balance, the sacred for direction. Then take the next small human step. Epilogue. Letter to the next fire. You who find this beside a cooling hearth. We were a small band once. Wind at the cave mouth, a child answering it with her lips, an elder lifting his palm as if the air had a face. That was the hinge. A sound became an address, and the address made a space for an answer. Call it God if you like. In that same breath, the animal learned a new posture, and the human began. Since then, we have walked a narrow bridge. We traded immediacy for form. Doors where there had been only sky. Vows where there had been only appetite. The price was real. Shame like thin air. Pauses that ache. The gain was real too. Rooms where love could survive weather. A center strong enough to hold fear when it arrives at a run. Two forces kept us honest. The arrow that points toward order, language, law, the empty middle we protect, and the gravity that pulls us back to the open shore. Heat, hunger, the animal's homesickness. We learned to listen to both without kneeling to either. When the arrow hardened into a crown that crushed, we bent our heads back to service. When gravity sold freedom with disappearing ink, we read to the end of the contract and kept our hinges on. If you want a rule from us, take only these small ones. Speak to, not merely about. It keeps the first night alive. Keep ritual without humiliation and law with tenderness. Both exist for the smallest person in the circle. Feed the animal well. Work, play, art, so it does not burn the house to feel the wind. Wear any crown like a weight that lowers the neck. Test it by distance. Does your nearness to the center increase the safety of the farthest? When offered freedom that leaves you edible or usable, refuse it. That is not freedom. It is a coupon for your undoing. Before a choice, ask 3 questions. What does this protect? Whom does this shelter? What will this make durable? Remember the ladders. We once used the divine spark to sort and to crush. Do not repeat it. Let difference mean obligation, not rank. If you can say you to wind and to bones, you can say you to lamb and stranger. Mercy begins there. And remember the pendulum in your own ribs. When order feels heavy, visit the tide but come home before the rafters rot. When the tide is wrecking boats, build hinges that open and close without shame. The point is not to be spotless. It is to keep the center empty enough for truth and full enough for love. At dawn, ash looks cold. Stir it with a stick. The ember is still there. Lay dry grass. Cup your hands. Breathe once, twice. Watch the small orange return and teach the air a name. If the word kneels again, it is not to make you smaller, but to make the room where we can be human, animal and halo, hunger and vow, without losing either to the dark. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.